Hello and welcome to The Download from Wise Woman and Wordsmith, where insight meets inspiration. A space for creatives, dreamers and visionaries ready to spark new ideas, ignite purpose and reimagine possibilities. Here we share downloads of wisdom, stories and strategies to help you thrive in your creative journey. I'm your host, Jill Marshall. Tune in, connect and let the magic unfold.
Show you tomorrow.
Hello, downloaders, and welcome to another episode. I'm your host, Jill Marshall, here to guide you through the mysteries of intuition and connection. Today, we're diving into a topic that's as magical as it is meaningful. Those little downloads we receive in the form of synchronicities. Those moments that make you pause and think, wait a minute, was that meant for me? Was that a sign? Like when you're mulling over a tough decision and suddenly the perfect quote pops up on your social feed. Or the very classic example of when you're thinking about a friend that you haven't seen for a while and they text or call you completely out of the blue. I once had a mind-blowing example of this. Now, I know it may sound like a Michael McIntyre sketch, but I swear it's true. Some years ago, I was awaiting a call from my colleague Jeff. Bang on time, because he's that kind of guy, my phone trilled. "Hi, Jeff," I said, not bothering to introduce myself. "Hi, Jill," he replied, and we exchanged a couple of howiers. And then Jeff started to relate his thoughts on my recent book submission. Fair enough, you might think. We both worked in books. But it was only after a few minutes of chat that I realised something. I hadn't made a book submission to this Jeff, or any Jeffs, come to that. In fact, the conversation I was waiting to have was about Jeff's book, not mine. So I slowly worked out what had happened. Somehow, my former publisher, Jeff, had thought he was calling an existing author Jill. Instead, he mistakenly called me Jill at the exact moment I was waiting for a call from a different Jeff. It still blows my mind to think about the bizarre telepathy that must have been going on for that to happen. And I don't know if it meant anything, or if it should have led somewhere, because we ended that call pretty quickly once I explained what had happened and got on with our intended calls instead. But I think it must at least show the power of intention. I intended to speak to a Jeff, and I did. He intended to speak to a Jill, and he did, just not the right ones. Somewhere in our universe, at that express moment, our wires crossed, almost literally. Now, we'll never know if the conversation we really should have been having was with each other, but I'm pretty sure that if that happened now, I wouldn't just put the phone down and mutter, "Well, that was weird," which is what I did at the time. Because the real question is, do these mean anything? Should we read into them? Or are they just happy coincidences? Let's unpack this a little. First of all, what are synchronicities? Carl Jung described them as meaningful coincidences. They're those moments when unrelated events feel connected in a way that's too perfect to ignore. Like when life seems to whisper, "Pay attention." It's as if the universe, or whatever higher force you believe in, is leaving breadcrumbs for you to follow. Sometimes it's subtle, like hearing the same song 3 times in a day, and at other times it's profound, say meeting someone who changes your life completely. Do you think everyone gets these breadcrumbs, or do we need to tune into them? The answer is they are there for everyone, but tuning in is the key. It's about being open and aware, noticing patterns, and trusting your gut when something resonates deeply. So let's talk for a minute about intuition, because intuition is like the antenna that picks up these signals. Think of it this way. Everything vibrates at a certain frequency, including our thoughts and emotions. When you're aligned, when your vibration matches what you're seeking or needing, synchronicities do show up more often. And if you're in a blind funk, you might miss the signs, or worse, attract things that you don't want. It's all about the energy that you're putting out. When you're in a high vibe state, you're grateful, you're curious, you're open. You're like a magnet for meaningful connections and opportunities. So it's not just about waiting for the signs, but creating the conditions for them to appear. And here's where it gets fascinating. Sometimes one synchronicity is just a little tiny nudge. But when you start seeing multiple signs pointing in the same direction, it's like the universe is yelling, "Go this way." For instance, back in the day, I had not one, but two close brushes with a band I loved dearly, the band Wet, Wet, Wet. I was a fan from the start, of course, always a sucker for a great voice and a bad boy grin. After I'd left uni and went to work in London, I saw them live at Ali Pali with some great friends, and then, a few weeks later, after work one Friday, a guy from accounts started telling us how the guys from Wet, Wet, Wet were staying at his house. It seemed very unlikely, but on further questioning, it turned out it could actually be true. He was from Glasgow, they were from Glasgow. They were the same age. One of the band, he said, was his old friend from school. Now, I'll admit I'd had a few sherbets. It was the 80s, folks. So get them on the phone, I dared him. Not batting an eyelid, he fed 10-pence pieces into the pub phone and chatted in unintelligible Glaswegian to someone and then handed the phone to me. "It's Grazier," he said. Well, that sounded plausible. There was a Graham in the band. That might be Grazier in Glaswegish. So I muttered hello, and Grazier said hello back. We exchanged a few pleasantries, and then I said, "So you're really in Wet, Wet, Wet?" "Aye," came the reply. "Well, I don't believe you," I said. "Okay," came the reply. And I followed up with, "If it's really you, play your drums then." There was a very, very long pause before he said very gently, as if to an idiot, "I'm the bass player." I said, "Oh, right," and slammed the phone down. Having made a fool of myself, I refused to go to the after party and actually meet Grazier, and I suspect went home on the tube, alone and with a strong sense of regret. Once the shame had died down, however, I didn't really think anything else about it. Then a good 10 years later, I got stuck in a meeting in Glasgow when I was meant to be boarding a plane to Manchester to collect my baby daughter. I could not miss that plane. It was the only time I've had to race through an airport as the countdown to the doors shutting in my face was being announced airport-wide. I squeezed through the gap and literally just made it onto the plane. Avoiding the scowls of everyone who'd had to wait an extra 4 minutes for me to arrive, I scuffled down the aisle to my seat. And there, in the 4 seats, directly in front of me, were Wet, Wet, Wet and Wet. All 4 of them. They all smiled at me kindly in a, "Oh, that didn't bother us" kind of a way. And then, just like normal lovely humans, they trooped off the plane and stood next to me on the shuttle bus at Manchester Airport. Martipello even favoured me with his bad boy grin. And what did I do? Did I smile back and say, "Hey, where are you guys playing tonight? My folks can babysit," or ask which one was Grazier and tell him how I'd embarrassed myself 10 years before? Nope. I stared out of the Mancunian rain as if I had not the faintest idea who they were. And then I got off the bus and I went home to my baby daughter and my child-minding parents. What could have been a life-changing moment. And here's another crazy example. A Kiwi friend of mine bumped into the actor Bill Nighy. Actually stopped and had a long conversation with him in somewhere very far from New Zealand, let's say Germany. Then a year later, she's on a tour bus with a pal in, let's say, Spain, and who should be there in the car park but Bill Nighy? Now, her friend, for some reason, didn't let her get off the bus to talk to him. But honestly, what are the odds? Really, she should have got off the bus and proposed, for crying out loud. Put a ring on it and married the guy. Because this stuff is everyday magic. It might mean nothing, but it might also mean something. Nudge you once, it could just be coincidence. Nudge you twice, it turns into a prod. Move. Take a little action. In fact, I've learned over time that there's a sort of 1, 2, 3 to synchronicities. As I did with the Jeff and Jill phone call, you might chalk 1 synchronous event up to weird experience. With 2, you might get a sense that you should be paying attention to something. When it gets to 3, well, maybe it's a time to consider that sign, an invitation, a prompt to do something and take action. 1's a tap on the shoulder, 2's a guiding hand on your arm, and 3 is, well, a tiny shove in the right direction. And it might not be to anything huge. A song that you hear 3 times on the trot might just be letting you know what you're subconsciously thinking about in the lyrics. This is so true for me that I have to catch myself if I'm singing aloud, because I might just be broadcasting my inner dialogue to the world. But then when you realise you're thinking something you didn't know you were thinking, you can address it. Simple. At other times, little downloads may be leading to a signal for you to change directions, to shift. I talk about this in my course on the architecture of abundance, how doors opening and closing could give you very clear guidance on what to do next. After 3 of Jung's meaningful coincidences, it's often time to say, okay, I'm hearing you, what do I do? Even when you miss the signs, life has a way of circling back. The downloads will keep coming, maybe in a louder or a more persistent way. There's a bit of a cosmic safety net keeping you steady while the new direction emerges. That said, if you're still not seeing the writing on the wall after 1, 2, 3 and more synchronicities, then beware. If you've ever ignored a string of signs, and I know that I have, it usually doesn't end well. You might go through what's called a tower experience in tarot, an illness, an accident, losing your job, your car, or your home. If you look back over your life, there will have been several instances when you didn't trust your gut, kept ignoring the nudges, and then somehow life took over and did it for you. So tuning into those earlier little downloads might just have smoothed the way. So what's the best way to respond when we notice these signs? First, acknowledge them. A simple thank you can go a long way. Then reflect on what they might mean. Sometimes the meaning is clear, and other times it's revealed over time. And don't be afraid to take action, even if it's just a tiny step. And let's leave you with some practical tips. How can you get better at noticing and interpreting these little downloads? Start by maybe keeping a synchronicity journal. Write down the moments that feel significant, even if you're not sure why. Over time, patterns might emerge. Practice listening to your intuition in small ways. These are the small ways, these little synchronicities. When you get a gut feeling, follow it and see what happens. The more you trust it, the stronger it becomes. It's a muscle and a reflex. My babysitting parents that I've just mentioned did this during one of the first breaks in lockdown. Giddy with freedom, my parents masked up and took their first bus ride in half a year to a nearby town. Mum needed her new glasses, Dad needed to get his hearing aid fixed. Mission completed. They had their coffee, they visited the supermarket in actual person and went home very satisfied with their grand adventure. However, just a couple of days later, Dad lost his hearing aid. It was going to cost many pounds to replace it, so he and my mother looked all over the house for it and then tried the garden. This was no mean feat, as Dad had spent the last few weeks digging up the back lawn and replacing it with paving on his own. I mean, the man was 85 years old. He is a machine. Still no hearing aid, however. So Mum followed an intuitive hit and suggested they retrace his steps on the only outing that he'd made several days before, which was to the newsagents to buy the weekend paper. Now, neither of them has great eyesight, but between them, they pored over pavements and scoured the streets. Nothing. At the very last marker on the journey, Dad called into the newsagents and asked if, by any tiny, unrealistic chance, they'd found a hearing aid. And they had. But that, my friends, is not the magical part. What my dad discovered next is stunning. The reason the newsagent had his hearing aid was because it had been handed to them by another elderly gentleman who'd lost his hearing aid on the same trip to the newsagents, who'd retraced his steps to their very door and paced around on the pavement to see if he could spy a very small object on a very large expensive ground, who found it along with another hearing aid, 2 hearing aids in the exact same spot. He took my dad's into the shop and he took his own home or wherever it was he was going to next. So either that was glorious synchronicity, or my father narrowly missed bumping into his doppelganger, which is a good thing by all accounts. My folks still have no idea who the other man was, and can't even thank him. I like to think that perhaps he was watching from the corner of the street as they approached the shop, heads bent, hope diminishing. Then wearing a gentle, satisfied smile, as Dad relayed the story of his found hearing aid to my mum, he simply vanished. And what does this remind us all to do? To stay open. Sometimes the signs don't look like what you expect, but that doesn't mean they're not meaningful. The miracles, when they appear, might not look like what you expect either, but that doesn't mean they aren't on their way. Stay tuned and stay hopeful. That's all for today, dear listeners. I hope this episode inspires you to tune into your intuition and embrace the magic of synchronicities. And if you've had a synchronicity or a download that changed your life, I'd love to hear about it. Drop me a message or share it on social media or your favourite podcast platform. And until next time, keep your vibration high and your heart open and keep listening for those downloads. They might just lead to your next adventure. Thanks for tuning in to the Download podcast. Feel free to like, comment and share and all of that good stuff. And for more about my books, coaching and business services, please check out wisewomanandwordsmith.com. Also, I'd love to hear more about your own intuitive hits and downloads. So do find us on Facebook, YouTube and more.